the 3 pillars of succession. We said, welcome back to you're tired, your key leaders are aging or maxed out, and we're in the middle of a great resignation or great reshuffle. Now what? So this is the third of our three-part webinar. Thank you all for many of you who've made it all the way through. We understand there's been a great turnout both from a registration and actually participants perspective. For those of you who may have missed parts 1 or 2, the recordings and the handouts are available. If you can't get to them readily, please just send us an email. We'll be happy to make sure you have access to those if you missed them. The same is true for people you hear who might have missed this third one. We will make the recording available as well. So remember, we're talking about what it was like. You may remember this slide from last time, this perfect storm. What do we mean by this perfect storm? We as business leaders, business owners are facing things that no leader before us ever ran into all at the same time. They may have had 1 or 2 or even 3 of these things, but all at once is insane. And so we can't go to anybody else to say, hey, what did you do the last time you went through a pandemic, right? You can't even talk to your best mentor about that. And all of the things that have kind of fallen out of that craziness. So when we talk about some of the political turmoil we're facing, you know, the wars that we used to experience in the world, they were overseas, they were happening elsewhere, and we were kind of isolated from some of this. But as we become more of a worldwide geographic community, it impacts us. And we saw that all the best economists missed that we were going to have a little dip in the first quarter. And much of that was because of the war between Russia and the Ukraine in the beginning of the first quarter. And nobody knew what to expect. Are we going to get involved? Are we not going to get involved? Is this going to affect gas? Is it not going to? What's going to happen? How is this going to, you know, impact the equilibrium that we're all facing? We also realize that there's heightened sensitivities in this political turmoil about everything. Social media is contributing to that, so is regular media. They get more clicks, they get more participants, they get more watchers when they are creating an us versus them situation, and that filters into the workplace. Remember back in the day when many of us were growing up, our parents told us there were 3 things you did not talk about in public. Or in conversation with anybody if it wasn't family, and that was sex, politics, and religion. And now it's all out there, and we're talking about all forms of that stuff, and it's making its way into the workplace, which makes things a little bit more uneasy, a little bit dicier, so to speak. When we talk about our labor challenge, come on, we all know the unemployment rate is crazy. Nationwide, it's hovering around 3.5%, plus or minus a little bit. We also heard that in places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, it's already down to 2.7%. So imagine what they have to work with. As a result, post and pray doesn't work. You can't just post a position, forget the days of the Sunday paper. You can't post it online. You can't hope that just LinkedIn or Indeed or any of those other things by posting it up there is going to bring you a wonderful person. The recruiters are all scrambling. I've heard of some of the best search firms who are charging outrageous fees, still working just on LinkedIn to find things because the networks that they used to have that were communal are no longer because of all the remote work and everything. It's really wherever these people can be found. The remote working itself is creating a big issue relative to labor. We talked about it a little bit last time, that the more people are working remotely and they say, oh, I'm more productive while I'm working at home. Well, not really. When it comes to the important, not urgent stuff, they're really not getting that stuff. When they say they're more productive, it means they're checking stuff off their list. That means it's the very tactical things. And the higher up they go in the organization, and certainly in compensation, the more you're really paying them for their brain power, not the ability to check stuff off a list. But you're really losing access to that because the more they get involved with those tactical things, the more they lose sight of that big picture, the ability to think conceptually, to think long-term, to think forward thinking beyond the next day. And so that's impacting us. Similarly, innovation. You know, you listen to in the late 2020, we had Simon Sinek, we had Jim Collins, Pat Lencioni, even Vern Harnish. There's a bunch of these guys all saying the biggest impact with the remote working is going to be a decline in innovation because we don't have collision time anymore. We don't have collaboration stuff. You can't just set an appointment for a Zoom call to have a brainstorm. That works a little bit, but when something hits and you can't just walk down the hall or you can't go, hey, and bounce something off of somebody, that's going to be an issue. We also have culture issues that are creeping up all over the place. If you can't see people, if you're not really interacting with each other, there's issues around being able to maintain the culture, to champion the culture, and certainly from getting it diluted. The economic worries are just multiplying left and right. We've had issues with the housing market like crazy. Now that's influencing things in ways that we hadn't seen before because we have issues around the fact that the interest rates are going up, and so the mortgage lenders are struggling to stay busy enough, and they're cutting back tens of thousands of workers. We have gas prices, and of course the supply chain thing isn't fixing itself. So we have all kinds of this whack-a-mole thing going on that we're all really facing, that we have to deal with all at the same time. When we look at that, then we want to look at these three pillars that we've been talking about in these three sessions. The first one that we talked about was how to deal with the fact that we as the business leader, business owner, we're just exhausted. This isn't fun anymore. This isn't the reason we started our businesses. And we talked a lot about, well, how can we get rid of some of that day-to-day stuff? How can we go back to doing the things that did return energy to us, or as Entrepreneurs Organization has always called it, ROH, return on heartbeat. What is that I'm getting out of this? The other thing is the maxed out or aging out leaders on our executive team. How do we find ways that they can exit gracefully or find something meaningful without doing everything that they were doing and groom the next folks to take us forward? And then now we're talking about what happens if one of our key superstars leaves, whether you call it the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle. We're focusing now on this third pillar and trying to decide how do we prepare kind of for the inevitable or work on really retaining those folks. For those of you who weren't part of the first two and haven't had a chance to watch that, here's just a sampling of some of the folks that we work with of all sizes and shapes all over, mostly North America. But there are organizations that are very small and ones that you'll notice in there that are very large that we've had the opportunity to really make a difference in. So, you know, in pre-COVID, there were many surveys that were run that said, you know, why is it that people leave an organization? Why do they quit? And it wasn't too long ago, many leaders believed it was for money. And we found that that was, at least pre-COVID, less than 3% of the time. And the number one reason, resoundingly, didn't matter who was running the survey, that employees would say they quit is because of their boss. Not leadership as a whole, their direct supervisor. If that's the case, you know, one of the things you can look at if you are seeing some turnover in your organization is there turnover in specific pockets? Who's the leader in those particular areas? It doesn't mean that leader needs to go. It may mean they need to be developed, but can you identify where this is happening? Maybe it is a result of the whole culture. But when we talked about the fact that money was less than 3% of the time, many folks pushed back. Oh, when we do our exit interviews, they tell us, they, weren't even looking. It was an opportunity they couldn't afford to pass up. It was more money than they could have ever dreamed. I'm sure you've heard all of those excuses. But the reason why people look, remember, when they came to work for you, you offered them a salary and benefit package, and they knew by accepting that, they could maintain or elevate their means of living. So they were very happy. Once they come on board, something makes them cranky. They become otherwise disenfranchised and they start looking around. What else is better out there? How can I improve it? And it comes down to their boss. Now, we said, we talked a little bit about this in the second session, but we do see people leaving for money, but those money issues are when there is a financial trauma to the household, many of which I call a young parent panic right now. So we have the old things like all of a sudden there's a loss of one income to the family, and that's a financial trauma. All of a sudden there's enormous medical bills, and that's a financial trauma. But in those cases, people are looking for gobs of money more, not a buck an hour. That's an extra $2,000 a year. That's almost insignificant on your take-home pay if it's twice a month or what have you. So this young parent panic that we talked about was, you've got parents with some young kids and everybody's working, the two parents are working at home, whether or not they really have two dedicated workspaces in which to work productively and independently. And, one of the kids in childcare has to be quarantined at home because somebody in their classroom was exposed to COVID. So they were home for 5 days. And now the parents are trying to get their work done and deal with a 3-year-old who's home. Well, you can't just ask a 3-year-old to take this document, go work on it for 2 hours while mommy's on a Zoom call. You have to interact with them. And then about the time the 3-year-old can go back to work or go back to the classroom, the 4-year-old comes out because something happened in their classroom. And so the two parents will look at each other and say, we can't go on like this. We're going to lose our minds. One of us has to stay home and be a parent, and the other one can work. And in that situation, it's not always the mom, but in that situation, whoever is then the working parent needs to, again, go find gobs of money. So that 3% may have scooched up a little bit, but it's not significantly more. And I'll show you the reasons why in a little bit when we talk about the reasons people leave their boss. But the other thing that's impacting us is prior to COVID, we actually, because we just haven't been producing enough humans, turned to our grandparents and great-grandparents to backfill some of these positions that we couldn't fill. Now, they all wanted part-time jobs, so it may have taken 2 or 3 of them to fill a single spot that a full-time position would have paid, but we could have done that. Well, what was happening when COVID hit is their kids and grandkids were going to them saying, please stay home, please don't work anymore. You're in the at-risk category and you're going to be exposed. So these people were staying home, or they were told, we need you to babysit because 2 of us need to work. So we saw some of that happening as well, and that was contributing to that great resignation or the great reshuffle as you were seeing people exit the workplace, and some of them just haven't bothered returning. So because it came up so frequently that the reason folks were leaving was their boss, those folks who were doing the survey went back to the respondents and said, what is it about your boss that is making you crazy? And it came down to these 7 things. I'm not one to always read all of my slides, but it came down to the job was not as it was expected to be. It didn't fit their talents and interests. There was no hope for career growth. And in that case, we're not just talking climbing a company ladder, but we're also talking about just having an opportunity to learn and grow and do something different, cross-train even. They had little to no feedback or coaching. They felt devalued and unrecognized, overworked and stressed out, or they just didn't trust or have confidence in their leaders. So when we looked at those things, we said, well, if those are still the primary reasons why people are leaving, but once they leave, they're not idiots, they negotiate themselves a better salary, think about the fact that your best employees have a great opportunity to leave right now and really improve their compensation because of how crazy the labor market is. So when it came to doing the retention of these folks, when we look at some of the retention practices that were going on, when we talk to our clients and some of our prospects and we say, what are some of the things you're doing? The most common things we heard were that people were increasing wages. The interesting thing, even when these were outrageous increases, studies have shown, even when you compensate someone more than they believe they're worth, it takes about 6 weeks for them to feel, yeah, I'm worth it, and only a short while longer for them to feel they deserve more. So that's a quick fix, but not necessarily a long-term fix. We also see a lot of increase in benefits. The percentage of benefits that are paid One of my business colleagues for the last 3 months, because of the increase in um, uh, cost of living and everything else, has been paying 100% of the insurance premium for every one of his employees for the last 3 months, and plans to do this while the economy seems to be a little unbalanced. There's other benefits, more work from home, increased paid time off, bring your fish to work day, whatever that is. We're seeing a lot of that. But when we realize the number one reason people leave, it really comes down to their bosses. So if we know the reason people leave is their bosses, why aren't we doing anything to improve who their bosses are or how their bosses lead? Well, in talking to some folks about why they're not investing more in leadership development of these bosses, many of them are saying, I don't know that I want to invest in these people. These people are so young or whatever. So we've got some really good news on the fact that we have to turn to some of the leaders, some folks who are asking to lead that are much younger than they used to be. I remember distinctly being in my late 20s and going into my boss's office and saying, hey, Cal, I think I'm ready to lead. Go ahead and have Pam and Tracy report to me. You don't have to worry about it. I'll take care of it. And I remember him looking at me and bursting out laughing. And he said, lead? You're not ready to be a manager. You haven't paid your dues yet. I'll let you know when you're ready, and it's probably going to be in about 10 years. Well, we were of the age where we were lucky to have a job, because there were probably, 3 people for every job that was out there, completely flipped of what's going on now. And so for 10 years, we got to watch some pretty lousy leaders and decide, I don't want to do that. And watch some really great leaders and say, ooh, maybe I'll be like that when I get a chance to lead. And so that was the way we learned. And then we were in our mid to late 30s before we really had leadership opportunities. So when you think about the fact that we're asking people in their mid to late 20s to lead, it's because we have nothing else. And I have never met somebody in that late 20s, early 30s who wasn't asked to do something to say, I'm in, I'll do whatever you want. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'll give it a shot. I'll figure it out. I'll learn. The challenge is when they're learning on your dime how to lead, how often do we do something really well the first time? So they're practicing how to lead on the very people you can't afford to lose. Now, the good news is we have to, if we can develop them, they should get to where we were a lot faster, because we just got to learn how to lead by observation and trial and error. These folks have the opportunity to do different things. And I know for many of you who use millennial like it's a swear word, I have some really good news for you. We work with a group called MRG, or Management Research Group, and they have been conducting leadership surveys since 1983, many years, decades. And they have a very unique 360-degree feedback tool specifically on leadership practices that cannot be gamed. Technically, it's called a semi-ipsative survey. So it compares leadership practices against each other, and you really can't game it. Unlike the really lousy 360s that are out there that are based on what's called a Likert-based scale, which means on a scale of 1 to 10, or from always to never, how cooperative is Tom? Well, if we had a really good conversation with Tom yesterday, we might say, oh, this was 10, right? Or what if I never give out a 1 and Susie never gives out a 10? Like, how do we average these things out? So you can see all of the biases that come into play with that Likert-based thing that the Management Research Group tools really exclude. So they've been a phenomenal way for us to evaluate leadership practices. And when they heard all of this whining about millennials, they said, we've got data that stretches back to 1983. So they looked at the Y generation, which are the millennials, versus the X generation side by side to say, what are the differences or similarities in the leadership practices? And you'll notice here, the X generation is in red and the Y generation is in blue. So if you notice, they're all pretty close till we get to this first one on persuasive. We find that our X generation is far more persuasive than the Y generation, probably Not so surprising. They have probably more experience to draw on and therefore arguments and rationale. The other place where they're really different is on delegation, that the Gen Xers are more comfortable, at least more proficient in delegating than the Gen Ys. Interestingly enough, despite all of the complaints, Gen Y is considered higher in production and higher in cooperation than the Gen Xers. What was interesting is that then MRG said, well, what happens if we look at Gen Y and Gen X when they were the same age as Gen Y? And when they looked at it, they realized it's considered statistically identical. So we have the same raw material in the young leaders today. We just need to find a way to get them the tools they need to succeed faster and better than we had in the past. So to that extent, the first thing I want to talk about relative to retaining some of your superstars and not losing them to begin with is something called our leadership acceleration process. And this is based on the 70-20-10 model. The reason I bring this up is because for the longest time, we've heard of training and organization departments and things like this. And what we've realized is there's a difference between training and development. And training is the typical classroom setting where I'm talking at you, much like this webinar. And development are many combinations of things that may make it a little more sticky for someone. But we know when someone is being trained, they're in a environment where it's primarily lecture, that once you're past middle school, people just don't learn that way. So the best thing that we can do is do something that makes it more sticky. So whether you're considering us looking at a development plan for you, some other outside service, or you're trying to develop it and create it from the inside, I want you to turn to the person with whom you're having the conversation, the person you're asking to champion this cause, and ask them simply, what are you doing to make it sticky? How many times do you send someone to a training class and they come back and you got nothing, right? Or they come back and they hit reality and they forgot everything that they learned. So what are we going to do to make it sticky? There are many different models out there. There isn't just one to go on. The one that we've latched onto is the 70-20-10 model. So 10% of the time, they're in a structured environment. So it could be a workshop. So even our workshops are not just lecture, they're trial and error, there's role playing, there's lots of interaction, so that's sticky too. And then 70% of the time they're trying to put it in place. 20% of the time they're getting feedback. What worked, what didn't work, what felt clunky, what could be tweaked. And this is from their observers as well as their coaches. And then they can go back in and learn a little more to address that. Then they can go apply it, get some more feedback, and it's iterative. It's very similar if you think about it the way most golfers learn. Most golfers are not going to just read articles in a magazine or just watch video. They know that they have to learn something in one of those ways, then go to the practice range and try it out and practice it a little bit, and maybe get a trainer, maybe get a coach. If you're lucky, you've got a buddy who can pull out a cell phone and take some video of you so you get some feedback on how horrible your swing is. Then you can go back in and learn some other ways to tweak that, keep going back and practicing, and that's how you continually improve that. So if you were to apply the 70-20-10 model to our leadership acceleration process, and by the way, in the handouts section, we have 3 handouts out there. This is the first one that you're going to find, so you can use this just kind of as a template. Again, this is not the only way you can approach it, but we found this to be very effective. And in the first step is a self-discovery step. So we provide a suite of assessments to give a participant a feel for what's their natural style. What are the ways they normally behave? Are they an introvert or an extrovert, an analytic or a creative? What are some of the tools they have in their toolbox? Are they exceptionally good at conceptual thinking? Are they really good at developing others? So we can look at some tools in a personal skills assessment. We can also look at their critical thinking, and we can look at what gives them gratification in their work, to really look at what makes the whole person when we put an action plan together. I'm going to come back to this action plan at the end of this session, but this action plan will have a measurable time-based goal. And I'll explain that a little bit further when we get to that development plan. Once we've gone through that and they understand what they really want to work on, then we put them in a full day workshop where we're teaching them 8 leadership techniques. By the way, today's session is an excerpt of some of those. After that, they have about a month to put that in place, and then another one-on-one with their advisor to review this action plan and say, so what worked, what didn't work? They may be given some additional resources, tweak some of the things that they were trying. Then we come back together for a half-day workshop, because there's usually a theme of what's going on with a group of people from the same organization to kind of fine-tune things. And then they have another month to put it in place and another one-on-one session to really tweak that again. So all of this takes about 4 or 5 months to make sure that people are being held accountable, it's actually taking place in the workplace, and it's very sticky. I'll also tell you that no matter how many people you put into this, 12 people, 20 people, usually 10 to 20%, everybody will improve to some extent. But 10 to 20% of the participants are really going to soak it up. They're going to love it. They are impassioned about being a phenomenal leader, and they're really going to take off because they soak it up like a sponge. Those are the folks you may want to invest in additionally to really groom and come up as your high potentials within the organization, and maybe even slide some of your superstars to maybe work specifically with those folks so you don't lose them. The next thing that we talk about is that superstars love scorecards. We love to win. We tend to be competitive. We like to know, what does it take to please? Everybody wants to feel like they're making a significant contribution. Nobody wants to feel like they're a loser when they, can't get things done in the workplace. And so scorecards allow them to understand, where's the bar? Show me where the bar is so I can sky over it. And the scorecards will allow you to do that. Remember, some of the things that were included in the reasons why people leave is that their job was not as it was expected to be, it didn't fit their talents and interests, and they felt overworked or stressed out. A lot of times this is because we've lost sight of all the things we're asking to do to our superstars, because if we're shorthanded, we don't have enough people to go around. Which are the people we're giving extra work to? It's the superstars. So they're not only doing their own job well, but now they're being asked to do somebody else's job. And sometimes they're feeling overworked, especially if it's been going on for a protracted period of time, which is something that we're all facing. So we have something called an accountability matrix, and these job accountabilities are an example of what they're held accountable for their job. It is not a holiday wish list. It is the threshold to do your job well. If you have salary pay grades, this is the midpoint of the range. You are competent at doing your job. So there is oftentimes an ability to supersede that. This is an excerpt of an accountability matrix. There's usually 3 to 5 accountability categories that you'll see on the left-hand side. And we bring together the stakeholders of the job to help us assemble this. So the people who understand what it takes to do the job well, who may supervise the job, people who might be impacted if the job were done poorly, will help us assemble this accountability matrix. We also go through exercises to figure out what the priorities are, how someone is splitting their time or should be as a percentage of 100. And the success factors are, how do we know that they've done their job well enough to keep it? It's the bar. They can absolutely, some things are pass fail, some things are meet or not, other things are meet or exceed. And so this gives somebody a real good idea of whether or not they're on target or they're blowing things out of the water. The percentage of time helps them understand how they'd be spending their time to see if it meets their interests, right? Remember, what job wasn't as it was expected to be, and it didn't fit their interests and talents. Well, this would give them a much better idea than the traditional job description that's just a litany of all the tasks, including and other jobs as assigned at the bottom. And so this really gives them a little bit more of a feel for what that job really entails. The last thing that I want to go over today, there's really more things you can do around retention, but again, we had just a short period of time. And so that is around development of the individual contributor. We already talked a little bit about development of the leader. So when you think about the fact that people don't feel like they have any opportunity for career growth, it's because their development plan really isn't taken seriously. And I find sometimes the development plan is a challenge for leaders because we feel that that has to come with more compensation of some sort. I have to pay them to go to a class, or I have to pay them if they've got some cross training. And perhaps that's true in some cases on the cross training, but not all the time. So in this career growth piece, if we want them to grow, there are other ways that they can grow. And we've always looked at 4 different areas that we might include in a development plan. And I'll walk you through this plan in a moment. But we believe the 4 areas are, if you look at the old time personal stuff, it was mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual. So if you think of the mental as being intellectual, maybe that's your old tuition reimbursement or cross training, but it's a hard skill or it's improving the critical thinking. The physical is now in the workspace, health. If somebody's healthier, they bring more energy to the workplace. If they're not taking off sick days, though I don't know if people have to do that anymore working from home, but nevertheless, if they are not working while they're under the weather, does that bring a value to the organization? Of course it does. The emotional becomes relationships. What if they're working on relationships between operations and sales? What if they're working on relationships between you and not just a client, but what about a vendor? Would that benefit the organization? Of course it would. And then finally, the spiritual is around your culture. I would hope that if someone is violating your culture, that you have found a way to free them up to pursue success elsewhere. But if they are demonstrating many of your core values, but there's just one, while they believe in it, they find that, I don't really have an opportunity. I need to spend more time this quarter really focusing on this other core value and ways in which I can demonstrate that. That certainly helps your organization. So don't think about the fact that everything has to cost more money. This is an investment, first of all, in those people as well as in your organization. But part of it is giving people an opportunity to set a goal, even if it's a little stretch goal, and go beyond what they're doing now. This development need and goal, remember I said it needs to be measurable and time-based. Let's pretend the development need I thought was I needed to be more innovative. Well, if I came to you as my boss and said, I'm going to work on being more innovative, you'd say, great. And then you'd say, I wonder how I'll know if she does it. Well, what if my goal was measurable and time-based? Meaning I want to create 3 new processes to eliminate redundancy in my department by the end of this calendar year. That's measurable and it's time-based. What are my benefits for reaching this goal? What are the risks involved? What are the potential obstacles? And we're pretty relentless about identifying those obstacles, because sometimes if you're not clear about what your obstacles are and strategies for overcoming them, that is what's going to create the failure. And if one of them is time, okay, how are you going to make time for this? If it's that I don't have the right people that I need to delegate some of these other things so I can focus on this, you can't address those strategies. And then on the back side of this form, because you have a measurable and time-based goal, you can have measurable and time-based activities. So maybe the first activity is I need to identify what the processes are where redundancy exists, and I should do that by the end of the month. And then maybe the next month, I need to talk to the people who created those original processes and ask them, what were they thinking? What were you trying to accomplish? Why was this piece in here that seems redundant? And so on. And so you can create those things. But that way, when you are asking them how are they coming on their development goals, you can actually see whether or not there is progress moving. Here's the key. And this is one of my favorite magic slides. If someone just makes a goal, writes down a goal, this is what I want to accomplish, the odds of achieving that goal go up 25%. If they write down action steps to accomplish that goal, it goes up 43%. If they share that goal with anybody else, 64%. And if they share progress against it, 76%. Can you imagine how wonderful your team would feel if they felt that they were making progress against their goals? So when we're thinking about how to really retain the people we have, think of it from all of those reasons why people leave their bosses and doing the inverse. The other thing is that you can do that we talked about in our second session, and I would go back and refer to that, is creating the scorecard on the existing job and thinking about it in its pieces. If there are 3 to 5 accountability categories, then you can sit back and say, you know what, I think Joey can do the first and the third one, but I think I'd have to source externally for the other positions. What would I do to round it out? And if you're realizing that this person was a superstar and so you added this piece on and then added this piece on, it may be time to unbundle some of these jobs, look at them separately to have a game plan for succession in the horrible event that you actually did lose one of these folks and you needed to replace them. So I hope that you found some value out of what we presented today. I hope you realize that there are things you can do that don't require any additional financial investment, but it might require some time and effort on your part to invest in your superstars. Many times we find that people spend more time working on the problem children, and it's the superstars we can't afford to lose. And so I challenge you to think about how you're spending your time, money, and effort when you look at your team and think about what you can do more on those superstars. So let me ask John whether or not we have any questions out there before we take a break.
Yeah, we got a couple. First one is, if employees leave bosses, what's the best way for a direct report and their manager to develop a relationship?
Oh,
when they're working remotely?
That's a great question. So the question, I'm not sure if you could have heard John, who's off to the side, but the question is if people leave their bosses, what are some things that the boss and the direct report can do to create a real relationship, especially if they're working remotely? The one-on-ones are never more important as they are now. And we weren't able to go deeply into that today. So again, if you'd like to contact me, you'll have my contact information coming up in the next slide. Let's just go to that. You can certainly reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk about the one-on-ones with you, but that's not a status update. That's about creating a relationship with your direct reports. It is critical, especially when they're working remotely. I'd strongly encourage you to make sure that it's done at least visually somehow, a Zoom call, a FaceTime, something, because you pick up so much more in body language. You can tell when something's off with your direct report, and that's part of that relationship building.
One more that so far, and that is the slide showed that the leadership potential hasn't changed from the generations. How do you know that an existing young leader has leadership potential?
Ah, wonderful, wonderful question. So the question was, when we looked at the slides and we realized as a whole, there's a lot of potential great leaders out there, but how do we know if a particular leader or young leader who's never led before has that potential? There are a couple of things. First of all, if you do show them the scorecard on what that leadership job is, many of them will either be excited about it or run away out of fear. The other thing is there actually is an assessment that we include in the self-discovery that's called the Hartman Profile, and it helps us understand what someone's capacity is, whether or not they ever had an opportunity to demonstrate that technique or that trait before. And we actually did use this with one of our clients who was convinced a couple of interns that he had that he wanted to use as leaders after they graduated from school would be the two primary leaders in his two shifts of plant operators. And we realized that the one really had the potential, the other one did not have any of the leadership capacities that we were looking for, and that allowed us to have conversation with him and ask him why he was interested in this leadership role. based on some of the things we were seeing. And, you know, we fine-tuned some of the questions. And eventually he admitted, like, he doesn't like leading people. He doesn't want to correct. He doesn't want to lead people at all. He can lead by example, but that's it. So there are assessments out there that can help us understand what the capacity is that can lead to some phenomenally rich conversations with those people before investing in them.
One more I got, and you say people leave bosses. What if I'm the boss?
Yeah, that sucks, doesn't it? We just lost one in the beginning of the year, and we tried a bunch of things, and I had to look at myself in the mirror and say, you know, now she was looking for more opportunities. She was a wonderful find. She's a great fit in the Metis group. We all miss her. We all loved her. But I had to take a look at what were some of the things I was doing to lead her. And one of the things was I was unable to fulfill one of her primary motivators. And she admitted that we knew that up front. We talked about it. We said, how satisfied are you going to be if you don't get to lead anybody else? That's really what she wanted. She is passionate about controlling her own destiny and that of others. She wants to be a leader. And there just isn't an opportunity in a very small boutique firm. And so she had an opportunity to take a leadership role elsewhere. So some of that was what I knew. Some of it is doing that 360 on the MRG 360 really is anonymous. It is incredibly powerful, not just looking at the individual traits that I showed you, but in combination of each other. So in other words, I know if someone is high in feedback and high in production, but super low in empathy, there's only one kind of feedback they're giving, right? So it's very anonymous, but it is a gift, a true gift to the leader to understand what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. And I found that so just about the time that wonderful team member was leaving, we did a 360 and asked her if she'd still fill it out on us. She had turned in her resignation, hadn't left yet, and she did. And I got a lot of feedback from the whole group. And one of the things is that I'm really good at delegating and letting things go, and I don't give enough feedback, which is one of the reasons people leave their bosses. So it's a gift to help you understand where you really need to refocus your efforts. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you're human, and you need to figure out how you can keep sharpening the skills and sharpening your saw and becoming a better leader yourself.
That's all.
Great. Well, thanks all for participating in all three of our sessions. Again, as you see this QR code or the link up here, you can access the documents, you can access the recording eventually, which will probably be there sometime tomorrow, is my guess. Our folks are pretty quick at getting those in. We appreciate that. If anybody has any feedback on these or some webinars that you'd like to hear us address in the future. We're toying around with one in September that might be, so you think you're ready for an integrator. Now what? So, but keep an eye out. If that's not September, it may be coming up, but there might be some other things that you want to pursue or do you like to have some conversation around. So please feel free to send us those ideas and we'll consider them. We're very honored for the level of participation we've had in these, and we're happy to continue doing them in the future. Have a great rest of your summer, folks.